In the early 1960s, many Americans feared that the Soviet Union was planning a surprise nuclear attack on the United States. What they didn't know was that their own government was considering launching nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union first. On July 20th, 1961, high-ranking officials, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, presented a plan for a nuclear first strike to President John F. Kennedy. The meeting was top secret. No official record of its content was found until 1993.
This was a meeting that was held at a time when Kennedy was receiving very belligerent advice from some senior advisors. A memorandum was prepared for Vice President Johnson summarizing the sequence of discussion at the meeting, and that memorandum was declassified in 1993. Until we had the Burris Memorandum, we didn't have a narrative account of what was said. President Kennedy was being presented with a scenario for launching a preemptive surprise attack by the United States on the Soviet Union.
The Soviets were lagging behind in the nuclear arms race, and top U.S. military officials suggested a nuclear first strike might be the best option before they caught up.
The United States had B-52s circling the Soviet Union in the air on a rotation basis. Each one of the bombs that one B-52 carried had many times the firepower of one Hiroshima. You also have to remember there were fixed missiles and there were missiles in submarines.
The plan suggested a surprise attack in late 1963. The cost would be catastrophic. In a full-scale nuclear exchange, an estimated 300 million people would die. Faced with the horror of nuclear fallout, including cancer, leukemia, and birth defects, the survivors would envy the dead.
Very hard to imagine that any significant organized human society would have survived. This is a question of whether human life in any civilized form is going to survive at all. Secretary of State Dean Rusk wrote in his memoir that as they left the meeting, Kennedy said to him in disparaging tones that we call ourselves the human race. Kennedy had an entirely different view about the strategic future. It's, I think, very clear that this meeting intensified for him the sense of danger that a war might be unleashed in circumstances that he might not be fully in control of.
Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us.
In 1961, the United States was engaged in a protracted Cold War with the Soviet Union, Red China, and the Communist bloc. The administrations of President Harry Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower had tried to contain communism, then roll it back. But Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev remained defiant. With both sides escalating the production of nuclear weapons, confrontation between the superpowers in Cuba, Berlin, and Vietnam threatened to turn the Cold War hot. It was into these circumstances that John F. Kennedy, at the age of 43, was elected the 35th President of the United States.
The scene on January 19th, 1961 was a remarkable one. It was the oldest president in the history of the United States, age 70, Dwight D. Eisenhower, sitting down with the youngest president ever to be elected, John F. Kennedy, the day before his inauguration, and sharing with him the most intimate conversation a president of those days could have, which is, what do you do if it comes to making a decision about nuclear use? He opens up the satchel in which the computer-like device is in that's known as a nuclear football. General Power, the head of the U.S. Strategic Air Command, has started round-the-clock bomber protection of the United States against a potential nuclear attack by the Soviets. Eisenhower says what he wants Kennedy to know about Khrushchev is he's brutal and calculable, that he's going to run hot and cold on you. It struck Kennedy that Eisenhower was referring to the Soviets more as animals to be tamed rather than negotiating partners.
I remember, being there at Inauguration Day. Oh boy, it was cold. I remember he said we must never negotiate out of fear.
Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate.
But then he went on to say, but we must never fear to negotiate. And I said, uh-oh, there's something new. We've just turned a page.
Kennedy, the first U.S. president born in the 20th century, inspired a youthful generation eager for fresh leadership.
There was a feeling at the beginning of the Kennedy administration that a new era had begun. John F. Kennedy came promising a new frontier. It was going to be a time of endless opportunity, and to be part of that era was one of the great honors of one's life.
I'll never forget the first time I walked into the White House to see my old friend Ken O'Donnell, who was President Kennedy's appointment secretary. We just looked at each other and burst out laughing. What are people like us doing in a place like this?
I was the youngest member of the Kennedy White House. I had graduated from college last. Everybody was very excited. We knew we were making history. We were ready to go.
I traveled everywhere with him. He was such an exciting man, but also one of great principle.
We were called special counsel, and I was assistant special counsel, and it was just perfectly obvious. The guy had a first-rate mind, and he knew how to use it.
For example, taking Arthur Schlesinger, the most renowned historian in the country, and making him a special assistant to the president in the White House so that the president had reference to a historian who could put events in perspective.
JFK pulled Dad aside and said, Bobby tells me that you're going to come work in the White House. And Dad said, well, obviously as a historian it's a great opportunity, I'm very excited about it, but I really don't know what I'll be doing. And Kennedy said, well, I don't know what I'll be doing either, but I'm sure there'll be plenty of work for both of us.
During the Kennedy years, I was a correspondent assigned to John Kennedy for the 1960 campaign. I went with him into the White House because I'd already been covering Eisenhower at the White House. Kennedy was a force in this town, well-versed on foreign policy and very articulate.
From the outset of his presidency, Kennedy knew it was important to fully assess his Cold War adversary, Nikita Khrushchev. Advisors had warned him that the hot-tempered Soviet leader would use threats and intimidation to impose his will. Carefully weighing Khrushchev's words and actions, Kennedy hoped to gain a true measure of the man.
President Kennedy wasn't even home from his inaugural day parties when Khrushchev decided to shower him with conciliation. First and foremost, he decided to publish the entire inaugural speech. Then he was ready to release 2 captured airmen from the reconnaissance plane that had been shot down the previous August. He'd been holding these airmen so as not to help Vice President Nixon in his campaign against Kennedy, and this was now going to be his inaugural gift. Thereafter, he also made known that 500 elderly Soviets would be able to reunite with their families in the U.S. Khrushchev is essentially saying, we want a new start. We have great hopes in this relationship. We really are going to work very early in your administration for some breakthroughs.
Nikita ist in die Weltgeschichte mit seinem Schuh eingegangen.
My father wanted to improve relations with the United States. First of all, he was true reformer because he really started reformation of Russia when he came to the power after the Stalin's death. And secondly, my father was in 2 wars, and he even could not watch movie about the war because it came back in his memory what really happened, and he couldn't sleep after this. So he wanted to show to the new president his positive feeling toward the United States.
While Khrushchev's goodwill gestures appeared to signal a desire for a new beginning, Kennedy placed greater emphasis on an inflammatory speech the Soviet leader had given only a few weeks earlier. In it, Khrushchev had said he intended to beat the United States with small wars of liberation all over the world.
Chairman Khrushchev threw down the gauntlet in the Third World by essentially arguing that the Soviet Union's foreign policy now increasingly would be to support national independence movements where the superpowers both essentially tried to gain influence. Kennedy was really quite upset about this speech, and he gave the text of this speech to all of his advisors and said, you need to read this.
Kennedy ends up carrying this speech around in his pocket, and he pulls it out with experts in his new administration, and he reads from the speech. He's so obsessed with the message that Khrushchev is trying to send him.
In a dramatic shift in tone, Kennedy used tough language to confront the Soviet threat, and at his first State of the Union address, he announced his intention to accelerate U.S. missile and submarine production.
Each day we draw nearer the hour of maximum danger as weapons spread and hostile forces grow stronger. I feel I must inform the Congress that our analysis over the last 10 days make it clear that in each of the principal areas of crisis, the tide of events has been running out and time has not been our friend.
The language of the State of the Union was almost apocalyptic in nature, and such a shift from conciliation to confrontation. And he ignores the conciliatory gestures and never really adequately tests them. Maybe they would have amounted to nothing, but we'll never know because he never really tested them.
Kennedy's struggle to understand how best to deal with the Soviets was only just beginning.
Kennedy's presidency was very substantially absorbed by the challenge of the Cold War, which played itself out on stages all over the world. Berlin, Cuba, Vietnam, and he's obliged to keep tabs on these matters continually.
Berlin, Nikita Khrushchev called it the most dangerous place on earth. Since the end of the Second World War, Soviet, British, French, and American forces had stood face to face in the streets of the occupied city. And the situation was growing tenser by the day.
One thing Kennedy brought with him into the administration was an awareness of the vulnerability of Berlin and the importance of the American commitment in Berlin.
In 1961, Berlin is an island inside of East Germany with an open border.
Berlin was divided into 4 sectors. The Soviet sector housing the communist government of East Germany. But the other sectors were in the occupation of the United States, Britain, and France. And Khrushchev wanted to end that situation.
Berlin was always a symbol to the Soviet Union of communist failures. Soviets were being embarrassed by the numbers of people trying to get out from communist control.
They were losing some 100,000 people every year, more than 10,000 every month.
It's the best doctors, it's the best farmers, it's the best teachers. So the front line of the Soviet empire is being drained of its intellectual and professional lifeblood, therefore threatening the entire Soviet construct.
If Khrushchev were to use military force in Berlin, Kennedy and his Western allies had few options.
If they march on Berlin, we don't have the troops to fend them off. What are we going to have to do? Going to have to use nuclear weapons. And what does that do?
Kennedy was looking for a capable advisor who could provide a coherent policy for dealing with Berlin.
President Kennedy brings Dean Acheson back into service, the legendary Secretary of State of Harry Truman, a hawk's hawk when it comes to dealing with the Soviet Union.
Acheson was a tough old hawk who believed that you didn't negotiate with the Soviets, that they only understood power. You had to be willing to fight, to go to the brink, to show them that you had the military capacity and the willingness to use it.
Acheson produces a memo that's tough. Essentially says you can't give an inch to the Soviet Union in Berlin because this is about the globe. If you start in Berlin and you give ground in Berlin, Italy's next, France, the rest of Germany, who knows where else?
Of course, within weeks, we had the Bay of Pigs.
In the years preceding 1961, a revolution on the Caribbean island of Cuba, led by Fidel Castro, ousted the country's repressive dictatorship and seized all foreign-owned property. The United States imposed an embargo on Castro's regime, freezing Cuban assets and severing diplomatic ties with Havana. The Cubans turned to the Soviet Union for support.
On Cuba, we know for a fact that Kennedy actually viewed Fidel Castro in 1960 as somebody whose revolution really represented the aspirations, broadly speaking, of the vast majority of the Cuban people. He had no doubt about that. And he believed that if the United States government had handled Castro right, that he wouldn't have turned to the Soviet Union. Of course, there's plenty of evidence to support that point of view. But very early on, he realized that politically he couldn't take that position publicly.
Only months into his administration, Kennedy would discover that the Cuban problem might lead to his undoing.
As soon as the Kennedys got into office, they had to worry about Cuba. The CIA had cooked up a plan to invade Cuba with a force of exiles, and the CIA was itching to use this force and overthrow Fidel Castro.
He had inherited the whole thing from the Eisenhower administration.
He had been told this plan for landing at the Bay of Pigs was going to be successful. There was no need for him to consider the necessity for use of military force by the United States. We didn't have to be directly involved. That was the premise. But President Kennedy was misled. His leading advisors, particularly his military advisors, had not given him the truth. Same thing was true for the CIA, by the way.
The basic issue in Cuba is not one between the United States and Cuba. It is between the Cubans themselves. And I intend to see that we adhere to that principle. And as I understand it, this administration's attitude is so understood and shared by the anti-Castro exiles from Cuba in this country.
The planning had been that if the invasion didn't succeed, the United States would introduce its own forces.
But the CIA never clearly communicated this rather essential fact to the president.
Persuaded by CIA officials who were withholding vital information and concerned about the political fallout of appearing weak on communism, the president authorized the CIA plan for an invasion of armed Cuban expatriates at the Bay of Pigs.
The Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs. It was a disaster from the get-go. 1,000 of them were basically driven into the sea or captured. Most importantly, there was no air cover.
Military and intelligence officials repeatedly pressured the president to authorize U.S. military intervention. Kennedy refused.
His argument at the time is if the U.S. gets directly involved, if American fingerprints are too clearly on the Bay of Pigs invasion, that Khrushchev will use that as an excuse to act on Berlin.
Kennedy was worried because he was coming up to a summit meeting, he hoped, with Khrushchev, and he didn't want to distract from that summit meeting by having too much attention be paid to Cuba.
What this Bay of Pigs quickly showed was that the dominant forces in the administration were people that Kennedy had never appointed, that he had inherited from his predecessors in the CIA and the military, and they basically were assuming that they could push Kennedy around. There was a kind of entrapment built into the whole scenario, and Kennedy realized that too, and was not about to become a president that was entrapped.
John F. Kennedy clearly felt that he'd been misled, that his leading advisors had not given him the truth, and that he had to be very cautious in the future about accepting anything that they said.
The CIA was very unhappy because they had confidently assumed that the president would approve of airstrikes against Castro's forces if the brigade got in trouble on the beach.
The Bay of Pigs was a major disaster for the United States, not necessarily because we had been defeated, but because it showed the world our bald aggression against Cuba. And it gave Cuba a victory over the Goliath of the North.
Kennedy took that disaster very, very personally because he saw it as a personal failure. You know, you do the best you can and things don't work out sometimes. Well, okay, but that wasn't the case here. And he blamed himself. I mean, he blamed himself for not asking the right questions.
Nobody likes to take a hit, especially when you're so publicly exposed. But yeah, I think he learned it, and what he learned is know whose advice to rely on.
Kennedy rallied in a number of ways. For one thing, he told the American people that it was his responsibility. He used a famous phrase that victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. But he took responsibility for it. And interestingly, his poll rating shot up to about 90%. Americans like it when politicians take responsibility.
The failed Bay of Pigs operation had enormous influence on Kennedy's image as a foreign policymaker.
The Joint Chiefs felt that he was soft. He showed that he was soft on communism. He did not have the credentials from their point of view to be able to stand up.
There was ambivalence about JFK. He was a whippersnapper. He was green. He'd been a Lieutenant JG in World War II.
He said I was a lieutenant junior grade and those guys were running the war. And I just didn't ask the questions that I had on my mind.
John F. Kennedy emerged from that catastrophic foreign policy failure, chastened in terms of the pitfalls of the use of force, and with a degree of wisdom about listening to the advice of his top generals, his top CIA officials, and other advisors, rather than listening to his gut.
After the Bay of Pigs, Jack Kennedy said he wanted to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces. He was so mad at them, and he almost did. He got rid of Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, and Richard Bissell, the covert operations chief.
Following the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Kennedy sent signals that he was interested in holding a summit meeting with Nikita Khrushchev. Frustrated by the slow pace of bureaucracy at the State Department, the president decided to reach out to the Soviet leader through unofficial channels.
Kennedy was determined to establish a dialogue with the Soviet Union and to see if there were issues that could be resolved and reconciled without a constant military confrontation.
The Kennedys operated on many levels, and they liked back channels as a way of doing business. And they found one almost by accident.
It was one of the most unusual back channels among major leaders in history of his brother, the Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, who knows all of John F. Kennedy's most intimate thoughts, and a Soviet military spy, Georgy Bolshakov, based in Washington, who really can't know anything very intimately about Khrushchev.
Robert Kennedy, when he met with Bolshakov, wanted to communicate a couple of things. One, that Cuba was a mistake, but also that he wanted to have a summit. The president wanted to meet Khrushchev at the summit that June, and that set in motion the summit meeting.
The Kennedys arrived from Paris on Saturday, the 3rd of June, and went directly to the residence of the US ambassador in Hitzing, which is a beautiful area, very posh area in Vienna. Kennedy had the severe back problems in Vienna, which is something that the public didn't know at all.
His doctors recommended him to use crutches, but Kennedy, of course, did not take crutches onto Vienna.
If you ask me what the mysterious term charisma is, I would say that's Kennedy.
Viktor Sukhotrev was with Kennedy and Khrushchev during all these conversations.
He was young, energetic, yet human, and could be frail, as all humans are at some point. My American counterpart was Alexander Akalovsky on the American side.
I had met Khrushchev on a number of occasions before, so I knew how he behaves. He was a very volatile person. He could, be enraged and then calm down right away and say, well, let's make peace and things like that.
During their opening remarks, Khrushchev looked intently at the president and then asked, "Mr. President, how old are you?" And Kennedy said, "Well, I'm 44. There came into Khrushchev's eyes a very wistful look, and he said, "Yes, 44. Well, you know, my son would have been that age, but he was killed in the war."
In the first meeting of his conversations with Khrushchev, Kennedy got off on the wrong foot because they engaged in a pretty intense ideological debate. People like Khrushchev, they know Marxist ideology very well. You can't really hold your own against them in such a discussion.
Kennedy, he began to fidget in his chair. I later learned that that was because his back was hurting.
After their first round of talks, as a form of relaxation, they went out into the garden at the ambassador's residence.
There was some discussion about miscalculation. The president used a number of times the term miscalculation, and Khrushchev said he couldn't really understand what it meant. And then at that point, he said, "Well, you know, for example, I made a misjudgment in Cuba."
He said, what happened in Cuba, the Bay of Pigs, the inference was that he'd inherited that problem from the previous administration. It was not really of his doing.
Inherited or not, Khrushchev suggested that a gap existed between American ideals and American self-interest. With little accomplished, the two leaders resolved to resume their talks the following day.
On the second day, taking place at the Soviet embassy, all the talk was about Berlin.
Khrushchev went into this tirade about Berlin.
He kept reiterating that by that very winter, the Soviet Union would block off West Berlin, while East Berlin would become the official seat of the government of East Germany.
Khrushchev kept saying that the decision to conclude a peace treaty with East Germany was irrevocable. It will happen. Nobody could stop him. Nobody in the world. That's his words.
And Kennedy was unprepared for this and was shocked at the idea that his leading counterpart in the Cold War was seemingly so irrational.
Khrushchev at one point said, you know, Berlin is like the scrotum in our hands, which we can squeeze at any time we want.
How the president took it, he turned to me and he asked me, said, "Alex, is he always like that?"
Khrushchev resorted to warnings that he issued about potential war.
Khrushchev looked Kennedy in the eye and said, "If there's got to be war, it might as well be now."
Kennedy, with his hands in his coat pockets in a typically Kennedy-esque gesture, remarked, "Well, it's going to be a cold winter."
John F. Kennedy was a very confident man in so many ways, even cocky, but he was humbled by his early foreign policy experiences. To have the fiasco of the Bay of Pigs and then get bullied by Khrushchev at Vienna was a pretty tough 1-2 punch that made him fear for the safety of the world.
You really see a president on emotional edge, feeling that he's failed in the most important moment of his presidency and believing that the stakes are nuclear.
When the president returned from Vienna, his brother, the Attorney General, found him at the White House, and President Kennedy was in tears. And he said, "You know, Bobby, you and I We're adults, we've had a good life. But our children, I just can't stomach the idea of our children not having a chance.
The summer of 1961 was a time fraught with great danger. President Kennedy got his advisors together. There were a series of meetings about what to do about Berlin.
On the one hand, you have the hardliners on Berlin, led by Dean Acheson, and then you have the softliners on Berlin, led by Arthur Schlesinger. But Acheson was the only one with a plan, and it's a tough one.
Acheson wanted the President of the United States to declare a national emergency, raise taxes, fully mobilize the military, increase defense spending by $5 billion, go everything right up to the edge of war.
What is Kennedy doing in this thing? Again, he's asking questions, constantly asking questions. And the question he's constantly coming back to is, what does the other guy do if we do this?
The world is not deceived by the communist attempt to label Berlin as a hotbed of war. There is peace in Berlin today. The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin.
I think Khrushchev miscalculated with John Kennedy. He was a lot tougher than Khrushchev thought he was.
Kennedy clearly wanted to send a signal to Khrushchev. He was ready to confront him militarily if that is what he chose. If he wanted war, the United States would be ready.
We must meet our often stated pledge to the free peoples of West Berlin and maintain our rights and their safety, even in the face of force, in order to maintain the confidence of other free peoples in our word and our resolve.
The message seemed to be how tough he was being with the Soviet Union, how he was standing up to them. But for the Soviet leadership and for Khrushchev, between the lines is a very clear message, which is, what I care about is our troops in West Berlin and our access to West Berlin. What I don't care about is East Berlin.
In short, while we are ready to defend our interests, we shall also be ready to search for peace in quiet, exploratory talks, in formal or informal meetings. We do not want military considerations to dominate the thinking of either East or West.
One can understand Kennedy's approach to Berlin at that time. He's less concerned about Berlin and more concerned about the dangers of nuclear war. He thinks that if he can help Khrushchev solve his problem of the refugee flood from Berlin, that he might have a more amicable, cooperative negotiating partner on a host of other issues.
Within days of Kennedy's speech, Khrushchev approved East German plans to seal the border in Berlin. On August 13, 1961, communist forces erected barricades and stood guard along the perimeter of West Berlin. Residents of East Berlin soon found themselves trapped behind a barrier that would become the notorious Berlin Wall.
Ich habe 1961 an der Grenze Ost-West, Ost-Berlin, West-Berlin, sowjetischer Sektor, französischer Sektor gewohnt, Bernauer Straße. Und Sie müssen sich das ja so vorstellen, eine Straße, eine Stadt, und auf der einen Seite wohnen die Eltern, auf der anderen Seite die Kinder oder Schwester oder Bruder, Frau und Ehemann, die morgens zum Sonntagsfrühstück zueinander wollen. Und an diesem Tag konnten sie. 1961
In der Berlin-Krise musste ein Teil der Deutschen lernen, dass sie kein Recht auf Freiheit haben, sondern dass die kommunistische Diktatur ihnen das verboten hat.
Die Grenze, die Mauer, wurde ja in mehreren Etappen in Berlin, Ostberlin gebaut. Zunächst wurden die Querstraßen vermauert, dass man die durchlaufenden Straßen von Ost nach Westberlin. Da wurden dann tatsächlich Mauersteine gesetzt. Und dann begann man, die Häuser in den Wohnungen zuzumauern, die Fenster, die Wohnungsfenster, die Türen zuzumauern, dass die Bewohner aus Ostberlin nicht mehr Richtung französischen Sektor, nicht mehr Westberlin das Haus verlassen konnten, sondern nach hinten Richtung Ostberlin.
We think of the Berlin Wall as being this terrible moment in the Cold War, a symbolic moment when the wall goes up between East and West. Actually, it was a relief to Kennedy because it was such a crisis for the Soviet Union to have this mass migration, people just fleeing east to west, that by putting up the wall, it stopped that, and in a way, it diffused that crisis. It made Berlin less of a crisis point. So in the long run, it helped the West to have a Berlin Wall.
Wir haben Kennedy natürlich sehr gemocht, trotz mancher Enttäuschung in der Berlin-Politik, und haben ihn sehr ernst genommen in dem, was er Liberalität und Freiheit nennt und Demokratie. Dass er natürlich auch gewissen Zwängen unterworfen war, das ist uns deutlich. Welcher amerikanische Präsident ist das nicht?
I think that there's no doubt that the people who were finding their own policies were being frustrated by Kennedy's policies were angry, they were frustrated, they were talking among themselves, putting him down.
Dean Acheson had grown so frustrated that during a small working group meeting on Berlin, he said, "Gentlemen, you might as well face it. This nation is without leadership." Someone serving the President of the United States, someone trying to frame his most important policies, talking in front of a group of experts and saying this about the President of the United States. And he said it even harsher terms in a letter to his former boss, Harry Truman, a few weeks later.
For a lot of Americans, Kennedy's early foreign policy days were amateur hour, and it was unsettling. The country was scared in the summer of 1961 that their leader maybe didn't know what he was doing.
President Kennedy's hopes that by acquiescing to the construction of the Berlin Wall, he would have a more conciliatory negotiating partner in the Soviet leader were dashed days thereafter when Khrushchev resumes atmospheric nuclear testing. Kennedy is trying to be conciliatory. He finally has to give up that course, and he has to resume, though he was very reluctant to do so, his own testing program.
Khrushchev said one phrase which I distinctly remember. He said, "Well, I pity the American people who have elected such a man to be their president."
Khrushchev perceived Kennedy as being indecisive and weak regarding Berlin and the Berlin crisis. And because of that, he was willing to escalate rhetoric, nuclear testing, etc. So by acquiescing to the Berlin Wall, he's facing a Soviet leader that is becoming even more troublesome and problematic.
In the fall of 1961, Kennedy would face yet another grave foreign policy decision, this time in Southeast Asia. A communist-backed insurgency was gaining momentum in South Vietnam, destabilizing the regime of Ngo Dinh Diem. U.S. military and intelligence officials believed the insurgency could be defeated and lobbied for the introduction of U.S. combat troops. But those familiar with the failed French colonial war in Vietnam just a decade earlier had serious doubts.
JFK understood, because he had been in Vietnam during the waning years of the French colonial presence, that it would be virtually impossible to defeat a Vietnamese movement, whether it was communist-led or not, that had nationalist credentials, that represented Vietnamese nationalism.
The reason why the war in Indochina has not had the support of the people of that area and the people of Asia has been that the French have maintained too great a degree of control over the lives of the people. And therefore, the communists under Ho Chi Minh are able to claim that they are fighting for independence, and the French appear to be fighting for a maintenance of colonial rule. I therefore believe that before the United States moves in any degree, that independence must be granted to the people, that the people must support the struggle, because unless, as I said, that support is forthcoming, any intervention by the United States is bound to be futile.
John Kennedy understood that the age of colonialism was over.
President Kennedy was not going to introduce combat troops into Vietnam.
So the first challenge to JFK's fundamental position of trying to keep the United States out of war in Southeast Asia came in 1961.
The consensus view in the military and intelligence establishment was that we had to protect South Vietnam, that was our client, our ally, that we had a moral obligation to stand by President Diem and to protect South Vietnam from North Vietnam.
The military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, really had bought into the idea that we could win in South Vietnam militarily.
This is the issue that comes up in November of 1961 with the Taylor-Rostow report, which recommends the introduction of combat troops.
This was saying we want 40,000 troops to go into South Vietnam and defeat the Viet Cong. And then we want to have 125, 130,000 troops just in case North Vietnam and China intervene, just to handle that possible contingency. JFK told his national security advisors, we're not going to do this. Based on my experience and my knowledge, my personal knowledge of Vietnam, this isn't going to work. And this is not an interest that deserves the United States going to war. So it was a very decisive moment when a US president really responded to a very serious proposal for going to war with a very loud no. However, as part of the political positioning that he felt that he had to assume, he then made a deal that he would agree to their request for thousands of US advisors. Advisors is an important word. They were military for the most part. A lot of them were economic aid people too. But it was President Kennedy's insistence that it not be our war that limited our involvement in that kind of way. We would do everything we could to advise and to train, but Kennedy was determined that it wouldn't be us that would be in the front lines.
In 1962, Kennedy's second year in the White House, more formidable challenges would beset the young president. Subordinates would question his leadership. and the calculations of his adversaries would bring the world to the brink of nuclear war.
At the beginning of '62, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, particularly led by Curtis LeMay, who was the head of the Air Force, were very scathing about Kennedy's inability to deal with the Castro problem.
¡Viva el internacionalismo proletario!
And they felt that in the end, an invasion of the island would be necessary, and then made detailed plans for an invasion of Cuba, and had, in fact, made a formal recommendation to the president that an invasion should be launched. At the same time, Khrushchev had very real concerns about the United States invading Cuba. Both Castro and Khrushchev were convinced that the Americans would try again. Khrushchev was determined to save Cuba one way or the other. And he came up with this idea that nobody else had predicted of deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba.
Fidel Castro wanted the Soviet Union to openly send these missiles to Cuba. There was no illegality about the Soviet Union positioning intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. The United States, under international law, had deployed similar missiles in Turkey and in Italy. It was the politics that worried Nikita Khrushchev. He believed that if he tried to openly deploy these missiles to Cuba, the United States would object. And so Khrushchev came up with this plan to surreptitiously transport the missile parts and the personnel in a way that would keep them secret until they were ready to be announced. And at that point, Khrushchev planned to go to Cuba and announce a fait accompli and have those missiles there as a deterrent against another Bay of Pigs.
He wanted to prevent American invasion. We have to send very strong signal that we are serious, and that means to him we'll send these missiles to Cuba that will clear to the Americans, be cautious, don't do this.
As plans got underway to begin Khrushchev's secret transatlantic deployment of Soviet missiles to Cuba, across the globe in South Vietnam, some of the newly arrived U.S. advisors were defying orders and actually engaging in combat.
The North Vietnamese leadership, they were very vulnerable, very subject to the threat of intervention by the United States in South Vietnam, and they wanted to do everything possible to avoid that. And so they did, in fact, begin to talk about the necessity for some kind of negotiated agreement, some kind of negotiated settlement in South Vietnam.
That information reached Kennedy's appointed ambassador to India, John Kenneth Galbraith.
One of the reasons that President Kennedy chose my father to be ambassador to India rather than keeping him in Washington was that this permitted Kennedy to call on my father as a foreign policy advisor. He had the experience of watching the French defeat in Indochina in 1954, so he had views on these matters, and those views were close to Kennedy's own.
So Galbraith sent a letter to Kennedy in April of 1962. Well, what Galbraith was suggesting was that they could get the Indian government to help establish some kind of contact with the North Vietnamese. There could be some talk about a deal under which if they would lower the level of insurgency, we would then begin to withdraw troops. We could talk about some corresponding efforts or moves to reduce tensions and reduce the level of war. And JFK definitely bought into that. But the State Department was filled up with holdovers from the Eisenhower administration, people who had these very right-wing views on East Asian policy. And so JFK understood that. He knew he was going to have to work around the State Department bureaucracy, and really Harriman was the logical person for him to turn to.
Averell Harriman was a very experienced diplomat. He had been ambassador to the Soviet Union in the Second World War. He'd been governor of New York.
Harriman had called for avoiding sending troops to Vietnam in November of 1961. But what happened was that Harriman migrated from JFK's side of the ledger to the coalition of military and State Department people who were calling for sending troops to South Vietnam. And I don't think JFK understood the degree to which he had really turned to the other side on that question. JFK ordered Averell Harriman to send a cable that instructed Galbraith to establish a negotiating channel with North Vietnam. What is so interesting about the document is that immediately Harriman, very heavy pencil, crosses out the part of the direction from the president that calls for mutual de-escalation. He actually sat on the negotiating cable, and in fact, when one of his subordinates tried to write a cable that was headed in that direction, he said, no, we're not going to do that. And there was never a cable sent. So it was an astonishing case of a leading official of the State Department completely subverting an explicit order from the president for trying to carry out a diplomatic policy. What Harriman did, I think, was a reflection of a much broader pattern in which all of these advisors were essentially subverting what JFK wanted to do.
There was a mindset that said no negotiations from weakness, and we're in a weak position in South Vietnam. And until that situation turns itself around and we can negotiate from strength, and the communists understand that we're winning, not losing, of course we're not going to negotiate.
Galbraith would laugh at that and say, weakness, the greatest country in the world, the strongest nation in the world, contending with Vietnam, a country of 50 million people that has no air force, that has no industry, and that is just emerging as a nation. The United States has to be afraid of that, not show weakness. And it's not weakness, which the president said in his inaugural address. It is not weakness to discuss or to negotiate from strength.
The lack of faith in negotiations held by many U.S. officials went much deeper than disdain for Kennedy's track record in foreign policy. For those who fought and won the Second World War, one of the greatest errors a leader could make was to take an enemy at his word. In 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had believed he could negotiate peace with Adolf Hitler. As a result, British war production was delayed, and England nearly lost the war. Appeasement was considered a dirty word by a generation of U.S. military leaders who knew all too well the human price of naive leadership. And developments in Cuba were about to test them to the limit.
The missiles that caused the crisis were large, medium-range, and intermediate-range nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. These are missiles that can fly to the United States, hit Texas and New York City, and a wide range of U.S. targets. The CIA discovered the missiles, and President Kennedy was briefed.
The President asked Bundy, I'm told, how many days we have before this becomes public? And Bundy said, maybe a week.
We're right in the middle of a political election in October '62, and Kennedy is torn lots of different ways.
He assembled, of course, a special group that they called the XCOM to help him deal with this.
All of the Joint Chiefs, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Maxwell Taylor, who was a favorite of Kennedy's, favored a military hit on those missiles, followed by an invasion.
General LeMay's attitude was, I'll take care of this, I'll bomb the hell out of them. And the president said no. And then the chief of staff of the Army wanted to invade, and the president said no.
On reflection, and he had a few days to reflect, he thought, well, a wiser course of action will be to impose some kind of naval blockade on Cuba to prevent more missiles from reaching the island.
He decides to forego violence, knowing that if he needs to later on, he can invade Cuba, and adopt an interim step, a quarantine, which buys time for negotiations with the Soviet Union.
When Curtis LeMay heard that Kennedy was not going to attack Cuba immediately, he was furious, and he compared this to Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler at Munich.
And LeMay knew exactly what that was about, because JFK's father, of course, was a great supporter of Neville Chamberlain and believed in trying to deal with Hitler.
Curtis LeMay, the chief of the Air Force, says to the president, "You're in a big fix, Mr. President." And Kennedy's taken aback and he said, "What? What did you say?" And LeMay said, "You're in a bad fix."
And the president said, "And you're right in it with me."
Kennedy went on television on the evening of October 22nd, 1962, and gave what is certainly the most chilling and frightening of presidential addresses to the nation and the world that has ever been given.
When he came in the room, he was deliberate, cool. I thought he was nervous. But once the red light went on, Kennedy braced in that seat, looked in the cameras, and he said, "Good evening, American people," and talked about what he had to do, but he was a different guy.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
И когда я был на Кубе, я имел воинское звание, такое у нас было, инженер-лейтенант. Значит, информация о том, что 22 октября объявлена блокада Кубы, нам была доведена 23-го, когда поступил приказ о переводе нас в повышенную боевую готовность. Было нам сказано, что они были направлены на крупные города, на Соединенные Штаты, в том числе такие, как Вашингтон и Нью-Йорк. Американцы окружили кораблями Кубу, закрыли все подходы.
With bombers, jet fighters, Navy vessels, and over 100,000 combat personnel assembled in the Gulf, U.S. military officials pushed for an invasion.
The invasion would have been very similar in scale to the invasion of Normandy on D-Day in 1944.
But they did not know that Soviets have 94 technical nuclear weapons there.
The Soviets sent tactical battlefield nuclear weapons that the CIA never really understood were there.
The Soviets had nuclear weapons on the beach waiting for an American invasion force, and that could have been, easily could have been the beginning of nuclear war.
Castro sent a message to Khrushchev saying that if the Americans invade Cuba, you should attack the United States with nuclear weapons.
The two superpowers are marching almost inevitably towards a nuclear exchange.
The U.S. military was not only primed to attack Cuba, the Strategic Air Command was prepared to launch a nuclear strike on the Soviet Union itself. Over 150 nuclear missiles and 1,200 airplanes carrying nearly 3,000 nuclear warheads were on standby should the president give the order. With the world teetering on nuclear destruction, both Khrushchev and Kennedy were determined to find a way out that would not involve armed conflict.
We know today that the crisis was overcome through a series of personal letters exchanged between Nikita Khrushchev and John Kennedy.
Khrushchev's offer to Kennedy is an exchange of Soviet missiles in Cuba for US missiles in Turkey and Italy. This poses a very difficult problem for the president because he's already been accused of weakness by the Joint Chiefs, by his Republican opponents.
He secretly has his brother inform the Soviet ambassador that the United States will not only publicly guarantee that we won't be invading Cuba in the future if the Soviets withdrew the missiles, but secretly, the United States and John Kennedy pledges to start to dismantle US missiles in Turkey so that Khrushchev can walk away from this feeling that he got something he needed.
Bobby Kennedy tells Dobrynin that time is running out. It's a matter of hours because the president is coming under pressure from his senior military leaders to do something.
The Cuban Missile Crisis officially ended with a broadcast on Soviet radio of Nikita Khrushchev agreeing to John Kennedy's public proposal of a non-invasion pledge of Cuba, the morning of October 28th, 1962.
The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
Khrushchev took the initiative to have it broadcast over Moscow radio in English, and it was the message that finally broke the crisis.
After the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviets announced that they were pulling their missiles out, which really was a great victory for the West, Kennedy wisely put the word out, do not gloat, do not brag about this, don't treat this as a victory. He was very careful. You never rub your victory into your opponent's face. At the end of the missile crisis, Curtis LeMay bellowed, "We lost! We should have gone in there and cleared them out with missiles and bombs."
Kennedy's greatness in the missile crisis was he thought in terms of avoiding the pointless deaths of millions of people, whether they were Americans or Russians. So in that sense, he had a kind of universal humanism.
There's a weird scene at the end of the missile crisis when Jack and Bobby are together, and Jack Kennedy, I guess thinking about Lincoln after the Civil War, on the night of his assassination, Lincoln went to the theater, and Jack Kennedy says to Bobby, "This is the night I should go to the theater." And Bobby says, if you go, I will go too.
I think any president of the United States understands that his life is at risk. And I think John Kennedy, who had his own very personal sense of mortality through the death of his brother, through his own wounding in the wars in the Pacific, had a very real sense of the possibilities.
Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy hoped to forge a new relationship with Nikita Khrushchev and restart talks for a nuclear test ban. Informed that Norman Cousins, editor of the Saturday Review and a nuclear disarmament activist, was headed to the Soviet Union, Kennedy asked that he carry a personal message to the Soviet leader.
Kennedy did want my father to tell Khrushchev that there was no one in the United States more eager than he to put all these differences aside.
Kennedy found out that Cousins was going to be in the Soviet Union. This was an instance where JFK saw an influential private citizen who was able to be a good back-channel envoy. And JFK was interested in restarting the test ban treaty talks, which had broken down because there was a miscommunication about how many on-site test ban visits each side would get each year.
I remember my father telling us that Kennedy said he was very scared of the power of the military in the United States. And what he was scared of is whether the military would somehow position itself and undermine his executive power. Oleg, the interpreter. And
Accompanying their father to see Khrushchev in the Soviet Union were Andrea and Candace Cousins.
Khrushchev, at that point, was staying at this lovely retreat on the edge of the Black Sea. It was sort of the Camp David of the Soviet Union. We came into this beautiful indoor-outdoor room with a pool, and there were glass panels. And Khrushchev pressed a button, and the panels folded back. And then, to our surprise, he says to my sister Andrea and to me, while your father and I are talking, why don't you take a swim?
While we were paddling around in the swimming pool, my father and Khrushchev were out talking about the fate of the world, basically. And I don't know if we really understood at that time how serious, how enormous these questions were, and how much was at stake.
What Kennedy wanted for my father to convey to Khrushchev was that it was time to start afresh and to see if they could go forward with their basic shared intention of a test ban treaty.
And Khrushchev said, you know, we're willing to restart these talks and get something going, but the ball's in JFK's court in terms of doing it.
Eventually, they came and got us and brought us back up to Khrushchev's study, and Khrushchev took out a great big coat and was fooling around with the coat, sort of playing hide and seek and covering himself up with it and then throwing it off and growling and then covering himself up again. And it was really delightful that this man, he was under so much pressure, and yet he had this capacity to play and to be silly.
It was very hard to square this personal view of him with the way he was pictured in the American media, you know, pounding his shoe at the UN, we'll bury you. You know, it was really hard to square those two things.
So Cousins comes back in April of 1963, visits the White House on April 22nd, and reports to Kennedy that Khrushchev is interested, but some of the hardliners are very skeptical and ready to denounce the U.S. Cousins follows up with a letter to JFK, where he suggests a speech of breathtaking importance, expressing his friendship for the Soviets, understanding of what they went through in the war. And he points out that the Soviet Central Committee is going to meet in June of that year, and says that would be a good time to do it. And of course, JFK forwards the letter on to Ted Sorensen, his chief speechwriter, and they agree that since JFK is going to speak at American University on June 10th, that would be the time for such a speech.
I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth, peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living.
Certainly the American University speech was a break with the prevailing wisdom and a break with the establishment, what the establishment view of the Cold War was, and whether or not we could survive and live with the Soviets.
Every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude towards the possibilities of peace, towards the Soviet Union, towards the course of the Cold War, and towards freedom and peace here at home. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man.
When Kennedy delivered his speech at American University, it provided a signal to the Soviet people that there could be a new beginning.
To make clear our good faith and solemn convictions on this matter, I now declare that the United States does not propose to conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere so long as other states do not do so. We will not be the first to resume. Such a declaration is no substitute for a formal binding treaty, but I hope it will help us achieve one.
In short, Kennedy made an advance towards Khrushchev, towards the need for more discussions and for a closer relationship between the two. That did not fall on deaf ears, let me assure you.
My father's respect to the Kennedy grew through these years, especially through the Cuban Missile Crisis. My father repeated that we are very different. We defend our systems on the both sides, they're different. We have one in common. We want to prevent the war, and I can deal with the President Kennedy.
I think the American University speech was a milestone in international relations, there's no question about it. With a little diplomacy and Kennedy's style, he brought Khrushchev around, and we have a test ban treaty today.
Many have argued that the limited nuclear test ban treaty was Kennedy's greatest accomplishment as president. How this achievement would rank had Kennedy lived and been permitted to fulfill his other foreign policy initiatives is difficult to measure.
In October of 1963, President Kennedy made a decision to bring the then existing U.S. forces in Vietnam out over a certain timetable. National Security Action Memorandum 263 was a decision document that basically summarized Kennedy's approval to bring out the 17,000 or so U.S. forces that were in Vietnam at that time. The first 1,000 would be withdrawn by the end of 1963. The remainder would be out by the end of 65. And that was a formal presidential decision. It was the policy of the United States on the day he died. That's, in fact, no longer, I think, historically controversial.
The most important indication of the thinking of JFK about his policy toward Vietnam was that the day before he was shot down, he had a conversation with his National Security Council staff member who worked on Southeast Asia, Michael Forrestal, in which he said that he wanted to initiate a complete, thorough review of U.S. policy toward Vietnam, and that the review had to include or involve the whole question of whether the United States should be there at all.
Perhaps even more startling than Kennedy's plan to withdraw personnel from Vietnam was his secret effort to engage Fidel Castro in a dialogue.
John F. Kennedy was responsible for some of the most infamous acts of aggression against Cuba, and yet, secretly, he was, at the time of his death, pursuing an accommodation with Fidel Castro. Kennedy's approach to Castro was buried in secret documents that were in a vault at the Kennedy Library until I asked for the entire file, which was titled Contacts with Cuban Leaders, to be declassified in the late 1990s. Could the United States actually negotiate directly with Castro? Top State Department aides were saying the United States won't talk to Cuba unless Cuba throws the Soviet Union out, and promises, guarantees that it will stop screwing around in the rest of Latin America and promoting revolution against U.S. interests. And Kennedy actually took a very different position. He told McGeorge Bundy, his national security advisor, "I don't think we should box Fidel Castro into a corner. I don't think we should make preconditional demands for talking to him that he may not be able to meet."
My father, he repeatedly told Fidel Castro that I trust Kennedy. I trust that he will not invade your country, and we will have another 6 years because I believe that he will be re-elected.
While U.S. efforts to destabilize Fidel Castro's government continued, Kennedy worked through back channels to explore the possibility of talks. In November of 1963, a breakthrough seemed near, and Kennedy sent word to Castro that he was open to negotiating an agreement.
He sent his own emissary to talk to Fidel Castro, a French journalist named Jean Daniel, who had come to Washington in October, met with the president, and when the president found out that he was on his way to Cuba, he basically sent a message to Fidel Castro with Jean Daniel.
Si vous voyez Castro, vous le voyez. Oui, oui, oui. Il n'y a qu'une seule chose qui m'intéresse. J'ai des tas d'ambassadeurs, tout le monde va le voir, vient de me raconter. Faites-vous une idée là-dessus, ça m'amuse. Et dites-lui, d'ailleurs, si vous voulez, qu'il soit communiste, je m'en fous. Il y a Tito est communiste, c'était... Sékou Touré est communiste, Sékou Touré, c'était la Guinée. Bon, je m'en fous. Mais qu'il soit allié à l'Union soviétique et si près de chez nous, ça jamais.
And Jean Daniel was giving this message to Fidel Castro on November 22nd, 1963. Castro himself was saying that Kennedy might become a historic president, one of the first presidents who understood that the world was a diverse place and that the United States could live with communist regimes peacefully. And so they were talking about this when dramatically an aide came in and said, "The President of the United States has been shot."
Vous étiez avec Castro lorsqu'on a appris la mort du président Kennedy. Oui, j'étais avec Castro et je peux vous dire que si j'avais à résumer d'une phrase l'impression qu'il m'a donnée, c'est qu'il avait perdu un complice. Et le mot n'est pas trop fort.
Castro turned to Jean Daniel and said, "There goes your mission of peace."
My father was very nervous because he didn't know who could do it. And that means that some hawkish Americans killed the president who want to preserve peace, and maybe tomorrow they will start nuclear war against the Soviet Union, because killing American president, it is not a small event. So he was very nervous.
One of the sadnesses of my growing up was that when I was a boy and Kennedy came to office, I was 10 years old when he was elected president. There was this great belief in public service and public life. And by the time I was a young man, because of Vietnam and Watergate, that hopefulness had turned to cynicism and apathy. That's a great sadness to me, and we've never quite overcome it.
Those who were living on this planet at that time had never experienced a president being assassinated. So this was a shock beyond belief. It was just staggering, yeah.
I think the most important thing that Kennedy did for us and for the survival of the planet was that he was able to go against a group that was powerful and speak up in spite of the fact that he was alone. I think that that's maybe the hardest thing for a person to do.
Kennedy said famously, "One man can make a difference and everyone should try." That is profoundly true. And it's not just true of presidents and with presidents. It's true of all of us, wherever we may be in life.
The nuclear threat is not only still with us, but it's greater than ever. And it is possible to take a stand against it. But taking a stand against it, as we know from Kennedy, is not just a difficult thing, but it's a dangerous thing. But it must be done anyway.
In a 1964 coup, Nikita Khrushchev was removed from power by Soviet conspirators who claimed his resignation was due to advanced age and poor health. Sources in Moscow later revealed that behind Khrushchev's dismissal was the humiliation of the Cuban Missile Crisis and dissatisfaction with his leadership. Forced from public life, Khrushchev's name was omitted from Russian history books, and in 1971, the former Soviet leader was denied a state funeral.
According to declassified records, in the month following his brother's assassination, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy sent a memo to Secretary of State Dean Rusk seeking an end to the U.S. travel ban to Cuba, calling it inconsistent with traditional American liberties. Today, at the United Nations General Assembly, a resolution calling for an end to the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the United States on Cuba was adopted by a margin of 188 to 3. This marks the 21st consecutive year the United States has ignored UN condemnation over its Cuban policies.
Pentagon papers made public today revealed new details surrounding the early days of the Vietnam War. According to the papers, President Kennedy's plans for disengagement of all U.S. military personnel in South Vietnam by 1965 was reversed by the Johnson administration less than a year after Kennedy's death.
Tens of thousands of people have taken part in celebrations to mark 30 years since the end of the Vietnam War today. By the time the United States withdrew its forces in 1975, the tragic conflict had claimed the lives of some 60,000 Americans, 1 million Vietnamese soldiers, and nearly 500,000 Vietnamese civilians.
I was initially inspired to make this film because of John F. Kennedy's idealism. And that's one of the things that inspired me to go to the Peace Corps after college. And I've always kind of wanted to know more about who he was as an individual.
We uncovered a series of episodes that have been in plain sight for decades, but are largely unknown to the American public, that we feel personify an effort to mitigate conflict, to avoid armed conflict. Things like his willingness to have a dialogue with Fidel Castro, his attempt to get out of Vietnam before it became the Vietnam War, his effort to use intermediaries who weren't necessarily in the State Department or in some other government body to communicate to foreign dignitaries, including Nikita Khrushchev. And if you look at those episodes reveal patterns in his behavior. If people have the opportunity to be exposed to those things, they will see a different picture than the one that is prevalent in the media today.
A Buddhist philosopher and educator from Japan who has inspired me in many ways, his name is Daisaku Ikeda, had written about John F. Kennedy.
His emphasis on how a single individual can change the destiny of humankind is sort of a through line for us. JFK represented that kind of hope. He, as an individual, he had a profound effect. Examining that hope and trying to figure out what was real about it and to bring that to life, to not only celebrate what there was to celebrate there, but to expose it to new generations is something we wanted to do. But of course, as documentarians, we had to go do the work and actually do the research and figure out, okay, well, we know, so we're predisposed to be inspired by this, so we need to be cautious and measured in our research. The possibility of nuclear war was really extreme in the early 1960s. What we saw was a president who took enormous political risk to pursue an agenda that avoided armed conflict. Many of the advisors, many of the people in the US government at the time, people who came from the Eisenhower administration, from the Truman administration, the generals who won the Second World War, these people were highly influential. When Kennedy came into office, he relied on the advice of some of these people. These were luminaries who had played significant roles in the Second World War, whereas Kennedy had only been a lieutenant junior grade during the Second World War. Well, in the Bay of Pigs, he found out that he had to be more discerning in whose advice he was going to follow, that people weren't necessarily going to tell him everything that he needed to do or that he needed to know. It's very easy for people to make caricatures out of the military leaders who were opposing JFK during his presidency, such as General Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay, during the Second World War, was charged with the task of leading the bomber groups that were attacking Nazi Germany. And Curtis LeMay understood prior to the war that the United States had not properly prepared for the eventuality of a world war. And as a consequence, when he was assigned to the task of leading the bomber squadrons, he had to knowingly send thousands of men to their deaths. So you could see the reason why a person like Curtis LeMay would develop an attitude that We're not going to allow this to happen again. Kennedy came into office with this sort of established Cold War mentality that was already prevalent in the government at the time, and he had to find a way to avoid nuclear war.
Especially during the beginning of Kennedy's relationship with Khrushchev, he believed that Khrushchev was totally unpredictable, that there was a very real and distinct possibility that Khrushchev could have started a nuclear war. From that point, Kennedy could have just given up and started preparing for war. Instead, what I saw was that he didn't give up on Khrushchev as a person, as a human being.
Kennedy's greatest weapon was dialogue, was his ability to speak to his adversaries and to put himself in the shoes of his adversaries, and this was a strength.
He still believed that maybe there was something in this man that was empathetic towards other human beings.
I think the two of them shared a knowingness, an understanding that's remarkable, and I imagine that continues today among world leaders.
It's a great example of how important it is to never give up on efforts to resolve a problem without having to go to war. There were many obstacles in making this film, but one of the biggest, I would say, was getting a hold of and getting the okay to interview the right people.
We had to ask ourselves, who's still going to be around and who can we go after? So, for instance, in the case of the Vienna Summit, there were times during the Vienna Summit when there were only 4 people in the room, and those 4 people were JFK, Khrushchev, Khrushchev's interpreter, and Kennedy's interpreter. So we thought, okay, well, maybe these guys are still alive. And as it turned out, Viktor Sukhadrev is still alive and lives in Moscow. And Alex Akalovsky, who was JFK's interpreter, lives outside of Washington, D.C. These guys were in the room. They were actually not only witnessing history, they were participating in it. So they told wonderful stories, many that made the film, many that didn't make the film. Of course, they also have the benefit of hindsight, that 50 years later they can look back and assess those meetings that they had in a different way.
Khrushchev kept saying that the decision to conclude a peace treaty with East Germany was irrevocable. It will happen. Nobody could stop him. Nobody in the world. That's his words. How the president took it, he turned to me and he asked me, said, Alex, is he always like that?
The history of the Vienna Summit was something that we spent a long time investigating. And I was very happy that we were able to pull the pieces together that we did. I've never seen a film that has both Akalovsky and Sukhadrev sharing their stories about the first-hand stories about the Vienna Summit. The footage and the photographs are quite remarkable, and it's a remarkable moment in history. It's a remarkable moment in Kennedy's presidency.
In short, while we are ready to defend our interests, we shall also be ready to search for peace.
We were very fortunate to have a team of researchers looking for material. Though I can't say that we were able to utilize everything that we wanted to get our hands on, we were able to find a number of things that were quite surprising. One day I was looking through the bins and I came upon this clip of Kennedy as a senator talking about how if the United States were to get involved in Vietnam, that it was not going to amount to anything good.
I therefore believe that before the United States moves in any degree, that independence must be granted to the people, that the people must support the struggle, because unless, as I said, that support is forthcoming, any intervention by the United States is bound to be futile.
It plays a significant role in demonstrating how this awareness of the situation in Vietnam for Kennedy predated his presidency.
I do believe that Kennedy would have done everything in his power to keep us out of Vietnam, or to have done everything he could to make our engagement in Vietnam very limited.
The idea that Kennedy was actually pursuing some kind of negotiations with North Vietnam is really important. Can you imagine the possibilities of how that conflict might have been different?
Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate.
It seems every year in world politics we have new conflicts, new potentialities for war. I think it's very important that we reflect on the importance of dialogue and for us to be able to continue to dialogue with people regardless of whether or not they are on the other side of an ideological divide.
Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man.
In his American University speech, he said that peace is impossible, that it's like a dream. And he said that that's a defeatist perspective.
It would be nice if our film can have an impact and suggest the possibilities of dialogue and how that can bring about change in the world today. We can talk about world decisions in platitudes and their political significance, but when it comes to armed conflict and the potential for killing people, Kennedy seemed to have this ability to recognize the value of a single human being. And I think that we can learn from that.